So, a couple of years ago, the principal trombone of the LA Philharmonic, David Rayano, came out with the Rayano practice mute for tenor trombone, bass trombone, and alto trombone. A 3D printed mute that has been my go to mute for practice when I need to practice mute in public situations. Not too long ago, they came out with the Generation 2 practice mute. Now, what are the differences between these two mutes? How do they sound? And which one do I choose to use to this day? Well, let's go over them and I'll tell you what I like at the end. So, they are both 3D printed. One of them, the Generation 1, is a little bit of a harder material with kind of a softer cork, what would take the place of a cork. And yeah, it's definitely a more texturally solid thing as opposed to the Generation 2, which is kind of squishier. Uses a different polymer. Even if you want, you can bend it a little bit, and it keeps its shape well. The entire thing is kind of made out of the material that the cork on the original Generation 1 was made. So those are the differences. Physically, if you notice, they're shaped a little bit differently. There's much more of an angle here, and I find that this actually comes out of the bell a little bit more, whereas the first generation kind of has a little bit less distance from being in the bell to out of the bell. If I put this in, you can kind of see in profile how far that comes out. Fits in my bags of Spain case pretty nicely. And with the Generation 2, you can see it comes out a little bit further, which makes it a little bit harder, to travel with. But on the topic of travel, also, the fact that this is like a semi-soft and a little bit more flexible means it doesn't break as easily. I had one of these that fell, and the resin kind of cracked, and the mute wasn't really as usable. So, for endurance sake, the Generation 2 is kind of a nicer option. I do find that the Generation 1 fits in cases a little better. So, how do they sound? We have like our normal trombone sound. Just to go over some ranges really quickly so we can get a vibe for what we're looking for. If I play those same notes with the first generation practice mute, it's fairly solid on intonation, and like um, every partial and every register really speaks through this, which is nice. Let me quick demonstrate the same notes on the Generation 2 mute, and I think you'll hear some differences. So, what's pretty immediately obvious to me from behind the bell is that the Generation 2 mute is slightly louder. And that could also be seen as like a slightly more filling sound or full sound. But in the low register, you start to have this sound that is in there. So that combined with the loudness of it actually makes it, for me, a little bit harder to like focus when I'm playing in like airports or a place that's semi-public or where I really don't want people to know that I'm playing around them. Again, this like that like extra airiness sound is one that I never really encountered on the first generation mute. So let's listen to the same notes on the first generation mute. Like there's still a little bit of that kind of airy hissiness, but overall it's quieter. And but the trade-off with the quietness is you don't get kind of the full like sound experience. You don't get the same amount of feedback. Another place where I notice differences between the Generation 2 and the Generation 1 is when you're kind of going out with the slide. You can kind of hear when I'm coming back in. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. That there's a little bit of a shh and a little bit more back pressure. And it kind of results in like you have to blow through it just a little bit harder on the Generation 2. With the Generation 1, those same kind of like glissando slide patterns, you still kind of hear it a little bit in the pedal range, but nowhere near as much in the higher registers. And overall, you hear that like kind of back pressure a lot less. When you're going to play something kind of loud, again, I think the Generation 2 kind of gives you a little bit more sound and a little bit more something to press against. Whereas the Generation 1 might be just a touch quieter. And just like maybe a little bit less airy overall. In terms of like ease of use, I do find that this being like a little bit more slippery on the hand makes it just a touch harder to get in and out quickly. It's just a little bit harder to kind of get my hand around. And that is also, if you have to do anything with like a fast mute change, like a contemporary piece that needs you to do practice mute changes quickly, it's rare, but it's happened before. That might be another selling point. And I find this comes out just a little faster, but neither one is like especially comfortable to get out. Yeah, they both have their tricks. I find that for taking it out, kind of the semi-solid, the more solid nature of this versus the semi-solid resin on this one makes a big difference. All right, so for me and what I need practice mutes for. Okay, practice mute is generally a thing that I don't like to use very often, but I'll use them in a pinch a lot. So if I'm traveling, like on a day where I have to take a flight early and I get to the airport and I have extra time, I like to practice at the airport. Or if it's like really late at night and I don't want to go to my studio, I'll do a little bit of practice at home with a practice mute in. For those situations, I find myself staying with the Generation 1 mute a lot more often. This is the one I take on the road, and this is the one that I prefer to use for sound and for back pressure reasons. I find that the Generation 2, which is well made and works very well if you like want to practice excerpts and have a slightly fuller sound while still having a practice mute, this is a great option. I still prefer the quieter and less back pressure and less air noise of the Generation 1 mute though. So considering that this is the one that fits in my case and I can travel with it easily, this is the one I will be continuing to use for now. Although if I was doing just like straight audition prep and almost nothing else and I needed to practice mute, the fuller sound and like more feedback of sound and and like tenor lists, you don't really have to play in the bottom pedal registers very often. I might use the Generation 2 more in that instance. Alright, so that's been my review of the Rayano practice mutes. I really like the Generation 1. Both of them are really good. Hope you enjoy.